And for more on this story, we joined via Skype by Duncan Ho of the Hong Kong Progressive Lawyers Group. Duncan, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Take us back, if you can, to the history of these protests. We know that Hong Kong was a colony of the United Kingdom for more than 150 years until Britain decided to hand it back to China in 1997. And I mean, it's safe to say that the Hong Kong legal system pretty much mirrored that of the British model. And now China, has reinterpreted that legal system called the Basic Law and now want complete control of Hong Kong. Do you think the Hong Kongers are now justified in the cause that they are fighting for?
Well, firstly, I think the Basic Law is not the full legal system of Hong Kong. The Basic Law, we call it a mini constitution of Hong Kong. What it does is actually preserves the legal system of Hong Kong, which already existed before the handover in 1997. So the legal system now we have in Hong Kong is that we have a mini constitution called the Basic Law, and under it we have different types of legislation, which is enacted locally, and under it we have all the human rights protection, which we already enjoyed before the handover in 1997. And now what the mainland government is trying to do is to impose a extradition legislation, which tries to provide avenue to extradite Hong Kong residents to the mainland China in certain situations, including where the Hong Kong residents have committed criminal offenses in mainland China, or potentially in situations where the Hong Kong residents have committed serious criminal offenses in Hong Kong. But what the Hong Kong people are concerned about is that the mainland legal system is very different from the Hong Kong's. And under the Basic Law, Hong Kong people should be able to enjoy the previous human rights protection as afforded under the Basic Law. And that's why the Hong Kong people have reacted strongly to the extradition bill, which was proposed by the local government earlier this year.
What are some of the basic tenets or the provisions of this extradition bill that has sparked this tension?
Well, the main problem is that there is not sufficient human rights protection offered under the bill for Hong Kong residents to oppose to be extradited back to mainland China. Under different situations in other countries, there are human rights protection prescribed under the legislation in the different countries. But the extradition bill in Hong Kong does not offer any relief for Hong Kong people who are accused by mainland to have committed crimes and were being applied to be extradited to China. The government said that Hong Kong people can raise their opposition in court, but under the legislation or the proposed legislation, the court will have to grant this order of extradition if there is prima facie case. That means there, on the face of it, sufficient evidence produced by the mainland government that the Hong Kong people have already committed crime. And Hong Kong people could actually not produce any evidence during the application in Hong Kong court to oppose the application. And the answer given by the local government to our concern was that the chief executive of Hong Kong could be the gatekeeper. She could actually refuse the application for extradition. But Hong Kong people have very little trust in the chief executive of Hong Kong because she was not democratically elected by Hong Kong people. She was basically elected by a handful of people elected mostly or appointed by the mainland government. And that is why the Hong Kong people are very concerned.
So in essence, China has a massive influence over Hong Kong. And does Hong Kong have the right to develop its own democracy?
Well, under the basic law, Hong Kong people are guaranteed to have universal suffrage. Ultimately, that's what it's called. But the basic law provides that the Hong Kong political system must be approved by mainland government. And so we have, since 1997, in the past 22 years, fighting to move the Hong Kong political system ahead into a more democratic system. But these efforts have fallen into deaf ears. We have tried to push, and 5 years ago, in 2014, the mainland government issued a so-called white paper, which require the mainland's prior approval for any progress in Hong Kong's democratic system or in the progress of electoral reform. And 5 years ago, in 2014, Hong Kong people already took on the streets in a mass rally, which lasted for over 2 years, but that has resulted in nothing. There was no improvement or progress in the electoral system in Hong Kong at all. And over the last 5 years, many Hong Kong people have felt very frustrated, and the despair has grown amongst mostly young people, because the basic law provides only a 50-year guarantee for the Hong Kong system to be separated from the mainlands. And now already 22 years have passed, and we have not seen a slight increase or improvement in the political reform.
Now, back to the issue of the protest, the ongoing protest, Duncan. Do the police have the capacity to contain this protest? Because on a daily basis, we see outbreaks of violence and vandalism, and more recently, the disruption of international flights at the Hong Kong airport.
Well, I believe the police have the power and have the duty to contain all the protests. The police have lots of weapons that they can use, and they have already used a lot of them. Tear gas have been deployed almost on a daily basis now, and they have fired rubber bullets, beanbag rounds, etc. Of course, there have been certain cases of violence, but mostly Hong Kong people still feel that the protests are relatively peaceful. There are only very minor incidents of serious violence involved. And actually, these protests have gone on for over 2 months already, and the government has not even responded to one of the 5 major demands of the protesters. And that's why the protesters have grown even more angrier, and they are trying to make the voices heard by the government. And one of the methods they tried to do was to stage the protest in the Hong Kong International Airport. And actually, before the flights were disrupted on Monday, the protests in the airport already lasted for 3 days, and they were going on peacefully without any problem. And on Monday, because too many people took to the airport, in reaction to the police violence that happened the day before, that was on Sunday. A girl's eye was shot with a beanbag round, and probably her right eye would be blinded. And police used tear gas in subway station and charged people onto the escalators, causing serious injuries, this sort of violence. And that's why over thousands of people took to the airport on Monday, and that occupied the whole airport and causing disruption of flights. And on Tuesday, during the protest, they found that there were some mainlanders among the protesters, and the protesters were very angry because the Hong Kong police on Sunday actually disguised themselves as protesters, and they executed arrests and in a very violent manner. And that's why the protesters were very angry at this guy's behavior or undercover operation. And once they found out there were some mainlanders amongst them on Tuesday, then they reacted quite angrily against the two mainlanders.
You know, Duncan, normally protests are held on the city's main streets, but then the protesters have targeted the airport. Do they feel the airport is a safe space, or is it a soft target for them?
Well, firstly, because the police have already basically stopped all protests on the streets because in Hong Kong, the law requires a so-called non-objection letter from the police before any protest can be legally carried out. But police, since July, have basically stopped issuing those non-objection letters, save in very minor incidents. And that's why the protesters actually have nowhere to go. And as I said, before Monday, the protesters already took a 3-day-long demonstrations in the Hong Kong International Airport. And the Hong Kong International Airport have not actually refused them entry or dispersed them in the airport for 3 days. So the protesters thought that it was a safe environment to protest, and as long as they remained peaceful, there was no police intervention, and the Hong Kong Airport Authority did not intervene. So I believe they thought that it was firstly a safe place, and secondly, because it could make their voices heard to the international community. And that's why the Hong Kong protesters have been producing pamphlets or posters at the arrival hall of the airport to let the tourists know.
All right, Duncan, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your reflections and your analysis of the protests in Hong Kong. That is Duncan Ho of the Hong Kong Progressive Lawyers Group, just giving us an overview and the history of the protests in Hong Kong.